Under the wide, open sky of northern Texas, where the horizon stretches like a tightrope balanced between solitude and ownership, Eric Coleman stood at the edge of his property with a cup of black coffee in his hand, listening to the low rustle of the mesquite trees. His land, 65 acres of mixed pasture and timber, was a living thing, humming quietly with the rhythm of bees, the shift of dry soil, and the memory of rain. It wasn't just where he lived, it was where he thought, worked, aged, and endured. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony when he moved in 7 years ago, just the quiet satisfaction of finishing the last paperwork, shaking hands with the broker, and finally standing on a piece of earth he could call his own, fully and without question. Eric wasn't a recluse, but he wasn't what people called sociable either. In town, he was polite, direct, and rarely idle. He knew the local hardware store by name, and the staff at the grain co-op respected him, even if they didn't always understand his refusal to join community barbecues or participate in neighborhood initiatives. He didn't see the point. His land was outside any organized development, which meant no mandatory community association, no quarterly dues, no suburban mailers about driveway cleanliness. And that suited him fine. If he needed something done, he did it himself. If he wanted peace, he got it by walking the fence line at dawn. No meetings, no ballots, no arguments about mailbox color. That was the deal he bought into, and it was in writing. He had taken great care to confirm it, too. Eric wasn't careless with details. When he purchased the land, he triple-checked the zoning status, reviewed old plats and easements going back to the 1980s, even paid an independent land use attorney to look for loopholes. The results were clean. His property was marked unincorporated agricultural, with no overlapping homeowner jurisdiction, no special district claims, and no underground leases or rights-of-way that hadn't already expired. For a man who'd spent 20 years working as an equipment consultant across the Southwest, often watching developers fight tooth and nail over 2 inches of pipeline or a disputed tract line, this was sacred ground. Simple, independent, controlled. That was why the envelope pinned to his front gate post stopped him cold. It was early, not yet 6 a.m. The sky was a pale, bruised blue, with just a hint of orange bleeding through the east. Eric was halfway through his first cup of coffee and had planned to check the perimeter before the day got hot. He spotted the envelope as he reached for the latch, thick, off-white paper, sealed with a red-inked stamp that read, Regional Property Notice. It didn't look like junk mail. No logo, no barcode, just a single line of type on the front. To the primary landholder. The language immediately annoyed him. That wasn't how legitimate agencies addressed people. No name, no property ID, not even a return address. He opened it right there at the gate. Inside was a letter formatted like something from a government office, but filled with vague jargon. It stated that his land had been selected for random inspection under Municipal Perimeter Clause 18-3, referencing a temporary oversight authority created by regional compliance boards. It went on to explain that a site visit would occur within 5 business days, and that a team may need limited access to non-residential structures for safety verification. The signature at the bottom was even more absurd. Field Officer 9B, Territorial Safety Unit. Eric read it twice. The terminology didn't belong to any regulatory body he was familiar with, and the signature was meaningless. Officer designations without a name or agency were usually assigned someone was trying to sound official without having any credentials to back it up. He felt the old prickle of suspicion work its way up his spine, the way it had so often when clients used to hand him suspicious invoices or walk away from site audits with a little too much urgency. Still, he didn't react outwardly. He folded the paper, tucked it into his back pocket, and went about his morning as planned, checking the southern fence, cleaning the filter on the water pump, jotting a reminder to order more diesel for the generator. But in the back of his mind, a timer had started counting down. He knew what a real inspection looked like. He also knew what it meant when people invented just enough language to get past someone's front gate. That afternoon, he made 2 calls. First, to a contact at the county clerk's office, a woman named Patty he'd worked with before when verifying deed transfers. He asked if there had been any recent property classification changes, site investigations, or registered municipal actions related to his parcel number. She looked and found nothing. "You're clear as a bell, Eric," she said. "We'd have a record if it were real." He thanked her, hung up, and placed the second call to an old colleague now working in private legal research out of Austin. He forwarded the scanned letter and asked for a quiet background check on anything using the phrases Territorial Safety Unit or Perimeter Clause 18C. If this was fake, he wanted to know who wrote it. For 2 days, things were quiet. No unusual vehicles passed down his road. No one showed up. Then, early on the 3rd morning, just after sunrise, Eric saw a dark, gray truck roll up the gravel drive. It didn't have municipal plates. In fact, it didn't have plates at all. He watched from his porch as 2 men stepped out, both dressed in matching navy blue windbreakers with reflective stripes across the chest and shoulders. No badges, no agency logos. One carried a clipboard, the other had a handheld scanner of some kind. Probably a prop, Eric figured. They didn't approach the house. Instead, they headed toward the equipment shed, making slow, deliberate circles like they were pretending to assess something. Eric didn't move from the porch. He let them linger for a few minutes, then stood up and walked toward the gate. When the man with the clipboard noticed him, he smiled stiffly, too rehearsed to be genuine. "Morning, sir," the man said, holding up the clipboard like a badge. "We're conducting a perimeter safety verification. You should have received a letter last week." "I did," Eric replied. "You got ID?" The man glanced at his partner. "We're with the Regional Compliance Board. It's a rotating designation. I'm Field Officer Marcus, and this is Officer Dana. We're not law enforcement, if that's what you're asking." "Then you don't have jurisdiction here," Eric said flatly. "This isn't regulated land, not by your board or anyone else. We're not enforcing anything, just observing. It's voluntary cooperation, standard rural check." "That your truck?" Eric asked, jerking his head toward the vehicle. The man hesitated, then nodded. "You realize driving on private land without license plates is illegal in this county?" The man's smile tightened. "We're not here to cause trouble, sir." Eric took another step forward. "Then turn around and don't come back without paperwork bearing a real seal, a statute, and a name that doesn't end in unit." The 2 men exchanged a quick glance. Dana, the quiet one, muttered something and stepped back. Marcus looked at Eric a moment longer, then gave a small, irritated nod. "You'll probably be hearing from the oversight coordinator. We're just the field team." "Good," Eric said. "I'll have my lawyer take the call." They left without further words. The truck backed down the drive, kicking up gravel, and disappeared onto the main road. Eric didn't exhale until they were gone. He stood there a long time, the letter still in his pocket, his eyes on the empty space where their truck had been. The message was clear now. Someone was testing him, not with force, but with ambiguity, with the kind of language that slipped past legal definitions and leaned on the average man's uncertainty. But he wasn't uncertain, not anymore, and he didn't plan to wait for their next move. 3 days passed without incident. Eric spent them working through the typical rhythms of farm life, tending to the irrigation valve that had clogged again, repairing a section of fence line damaged during last month's windstorm, and preparing one of the eastern plots for a test run of early barley he'd been planning since March. His mind, though focused on the physical, never strayed far from that strange encounter with the so-called inspectors. He wasn't the kind of man who made assumptions lightly, but he'd learned over the years to trust the parts of his instincts that didn't come with explanations. And those instincts now told him, loud and clear, that someone had not only targeted his property but had done so with enough forethought to believe they could get away with it. The way the two men had spoken, so casually with such scripted detachment, reminded him less of government officials and more of process servers rehearsing intimidation. And it wasn't just what they did or didn't say, it was what they expected him to believe without question. As though wearing the right windbreaker and adopting the right clipped vocabulary would be enough to convince him to open his gates and step aside. But Eric wasn't wired that way. He didn't take anyone's word as gospel, especially not when the word came without a name, a badge, or a statute number he could look up. The real trouble started not with another visit or warning, but with a notice tacked, not mailed, to the inside of his pump station door, a place no one had access to without entering his land, opening a locked fence and walking a solid 200 yards from the main gate. He found it early in the morning while doing his routine inspection, unfolding the paper slowly as he squatted beside the diesel pump, half expecting it to be a discarded note or some stray packaging blown in by the wind. But what he found instead was another document, this one stamped with the now familiar red insignia, Regional Property Safety Notice. The wording had evolved slightly but was no less nebulous. The letter claimed that, in light of non-cooperation with field investigators, a preliminary risk tag has been applied to perimeter structure B, which, judging from the vague diagram included, referred to his west side shed near the orchard. It warned that any future obstruction of compliance efforts would be documented and forwarded to the Executive Committee for Escalation, a phrase so self-important and legal-sounding it bordered on parody. But there was nothing funny about it. This wasn't just bluster, it was trespass, and deliberate at that. Eric immediately walked the length of the property checking all gates and camera mounts. The latter, though functional, had no recordings of the incident, likely due to being briefly disabled or bypassed. He found no obvious signs of forced entry. Whoever had done this had come prepared, moved with purpose, and left without leaving prints or being caught on tape. The realization that someone had not only breached his land but done so undetected caused his stomach to harden with a cold weight. This wasn't a warning, it was a move. A quiet escalation intended to signal dominance and unsettle him. And it worked, to a point. He wasn't afraid, not in the traditional sense, but he felt the pull of anger, of defensive readiness, starting to stir beneath the surface. These weren't just pranksters or opportunists. This was targeted, procedural harassment designed to test his boundaries, both physical and legal. Later that same day, while still chewing over the implications of the break-in, Eric received an email from his legal contact in Austin. The message was short, but the attached file spoke volumes. According to the investigators' findings, the phrases used in the original notice and in the most recent posting did not correspond to any recognized state or federal language used in property regulation, agriculture inspection, or safety zoning. There were no known agencies using the title Territorial Safety Unit, nor were there any municipal codes matching the 18C clause referenced earlier. More interestingly, a related search turned up a privately registered LLC called Perimeter Solutions Consulting, established just under 2 years ago in a neighboring state with a vague business description tied to land use mediation and compliance advisory. No staff names, no operating licenses listed, and no client portfolios published. It was a shell, possibly one of many. The email concluded with a note of caution. The legal advisor made clear that, while the letters lacked statutory power, they were cleverly worded to exploit procedural ignorance. If someone were to take them at face value, the message read, they might voluntarily grant access, believing themselves under a legal obligation. It's pressure by appearance, not law. Eric leaned back in his chair, the sun outside now fully risen and burning hot against the workshop windows. Pressure by appearance. That's exactly what it was. The men, the notices, even the way they placed documents in places that made him feel watched. It was psychological warfare dressed in paperwork and blue windbreakers. And now that he'd failed to yield, they'd crossed into more invasive territory. He opened his desk drawer and retrieved the worn legal binder he'd kept since buying the property. Inside were the original contracts, deed records, soil surveys, and utility maps, all meticulously organized and up to date. He added the new documents along with the printed email summary and marked the folder with a post-it. Unauthorized activity, 2025. That night, Eric did not sleep well. Not because he feared another visit, he doubted they'd return so soon after being confronted, but because his mind kept turning over the logistics. If these people had such a refined system of intimidation, then he likely wasn't the only one being targeted. More than that, if they were placing these tags on structures and taking pictures, what was the end game? Lawsuits? Seizure? Or were they building a case of some kind, false violations or manufactured non-compliance, to later use against him in court, or worse, to justify the sale or acquisition of his land through some loophole in zoning or environmental regulation? The next morning brought a new variable. While checking his mailbox, Eric found a large manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a single-folded document labeled Property Zoning Update, Tier 3 Environmental Buffer Notification. He scanned it quickly. The document claimed that due to newly identified watershed sensitivity thresholds, his parcel was being temporarily reclassified under a protective environmental status pending further review. The implication was clear. Under such a reclassification, development, excavation, or even planting could be restricted until further notice. This had serious implications. Not only would it prevent him from tilling sections of the land, but it could also lead to a devaluation of the property, or set the stage for a compulsory audit from an environmental board. Eric knew for a fact that no such threshold existed. His land sat atop stable clay strata, with minimal runoff and no critical aquifers nearby. He'd confirmed that years ago, even submitted a soil integrity survey for tax purposes. There was no buffer zone. There never had been. This wasn't just harassment. It was a direct threat to the operability of his land, disguised as bureaucratic procedure. The document, of course, bore no recognizable agency name, just the same red stamp and blocky, faceless formatting. The pattern was now undeniable. Someone had targeted his property through a campaign of fraudulent regulation, using official-sounding language and vague authority to create a paper trail of alleged non-compliance. It wasn't about law. It was about pressure. Deliberate, calculated, and slowly escalating. The next move, Eric realized, would likely involve real consequences. A fine, a lien, maybe even an injunction, if they were bold enough to try it. So he decided to change tactics. Rather than wait for the next escalation, Eric filed his own notice. That same day, through his lawyer, he submitted a formal request to the county assessor's office demanding a verification of zoning status, along with a declaration of no known changes to land use or environmental classification. He also submitted a statement to the sheriff's department, citing unauthorized access to private land by individuals impersonating regulatory officials, including scanned copies of the documents he'd received. He didn't expect immediate action, but it created a formal record, and, more importantly, it pushed the issue into official channels where fraud carried real consequences. He knew what he was doing: documenting, escalating legally, and building a case of his own. Because the only thing more dangerous than a paper predator is a landowner who knows how to respond in kind, and who isn't afraid to see it through. Eric had always believed in escalation by necessity, not instinct. In his years consulting for operations across the western states, he'd watched too many disputes dissolve into unproductive bluster because someone let pride drive their decisions instead of precision. That mindset had served him well on the farm. Weather problems, equipment failures, occasional issues with supply chains, but this was something different. This was calculated manipulation, and it was now encroaching on his livelihood with the deliberate pacing of someone who had played this game many times before. Still, even with the fabricated notices, the coordinated intimidation, and the faceless bureaucracy being thrown at him, Eric had hoped, perhaps naively, that by formalizing the record of trespass and fraudulent claims, he might stall whatever plan was unfolding against his land. That hope lasted 5 days. On the 6th day, just before noon, a truck that Eric didn't recognize turned off the gravel road and slowly pulled up along the outer gate. It wasn't the same truck used by the previous visitors, but the similarities were undeniable. No plates, factory black paint, and a slightly raised chassis. The type of vehicle common enough to not raise suspicion unless you were already watching for it. Eric stood in the shade of his barn, arms folded, squinting into the sun as 2 men got out. They weren't in matching windbreakers this time, but the attire was still carefully generic: khaki cargo pants, utility boots, and button-down shirts that had no logos or patches. They moved with a quiet confidence that set Eric's jaw tight. These weren't locals, and they weren't volunteers. One of them was carrying a padded aluminum case, the kind typically used for survey equipment or sensitive instruments. The other held what appeared to be a portable antenna array slung over his shoulder. They didn't approach the house. Instead, they began walking the fence line, examining the posts, stopping occasionally to tap something into a handheld device. Eric didn't go to greet them. Instead, he returned to the house, grabbed the laminated copy of his boundary survey, and called the sheriff's office again, referencing the open report number he'd filed the previous week. He kept the call short and calm, informing dispatch that there were unknown individuals on his property line using unknown electronic equipment, and that prior trespassing had been documented. The woman on the line acknowledged the file and said a deputy would be dispatched when available. By the time Eric returned to the front of the property, the men had opened the aluminum case and set up a small triangular rig, 2 poles with a central receiver, positioned on a tripod aimed toward the middle of his land. It didn't take much imagination to guess what they were doing. Whether it was soil scanning, signal interception, or something more sophisticated, it was being done without permission and without disclosure. Eric didn't confront them. Not yet. He walked the long arc of his internal path, circled to the back of the shed, and retrieved the drone he kept charged for seasonal mapping. Within 10 minutes he had footage, wide-angle, time-stamped, and geolocated, of both men and their equipment. When the sheriff's deputy arrived nearly an hour later, the men were already packing up, and the antenna was gone. The deputy, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a friendly but wary demeanor, took Eric's statement, reviewed the footage, and asked the obvious questions. Did Eric recognize either man? Had they announced themselves? Left paperwork? The answers were no, no, and no. The deputy, to his credit, didn't dismiss the situation. He made his own notes, asked if Eric wanted to press trespassing charges. He did, and said he would file a supplemental report to the existing complaint. But he also made it clear that unless Eric caught them in the act again, and unless they were specifically warned to leave, enforcement would be limited. "We're spread thin," the deputy said, almost apologetically. "These guys know how to stay just inside the line. But you're doing the right thing. Document everything." It wasn't the response Eric had hoped for, but it was the response he expected. By the end of the day, he had secured digital copies of the new report, appended his drone footage to the file, and forwarded everything to his legal contact in Austin. He also took the step of hiring a local land use firm to begin a formal audit, an expensive move, but one that would ensure a professional surveyor could verify no underground installations, sensor arrays, or environmental modifications had been made on his property without his consent. He wasn't just reacting now. He was preparing. 2 days later, the escalation turned from strategic to physical. It started with a flicker, barely noticeable at first, on the control panel of his irrigation system. The digital readout, normally rock steady, blinked a warning. Flow disruption detected. Eric checked the main valve. Open. The power relay. Active. But the southern field, where the newest barley was sprouting, showed 0 output. He drove down to the substation, a half-buried metal housing nestled near the tree line, and found the access panel unbolted. Inside, the wiring was intact, but a small plastic component had been inserted between the circuit relay and the moisture sensor input. It was a shunt, crude but effective. Whoever placed it had interrupted the signal, disabling the alert to the system while leaving power flow unaffected. This wasn't vandalism. It was targeted sabotage, designed to cripple his watering without setting off alarms. Eric photographed the component, removed it, and contacted both the sheriff's office and his lawyer. The deputy arrived within the hour and, this time, took the matter more seriously. The presence of foreign hardware inside a locked utility system, especially one related to agriculture, could fall under state-level sabotage if proven deliberate. They collected the device as evidence. Eric, meanwhile, reached out to a private cyber-physical security consultant he'd worked with years ago. He was done waiting. It was time to shift from defense to countermeasures. By the end of the week, his property was under full monitoring. Not just cameras, but buried perimeter sensors, signal tracers, and hardwired intrusion detectors. Nothing fancy or illegal, just tactical systems designed to record ingress and environmental changes. His consultant installed a failsafe in the irrigation control panel that couldn't be bypassed externally. Meanwhile, the legal team in Austin prepared a civil claim packet documenting sustained harassment, unauthorized surveillance, and disruption of commercial operations, all with time-coded evidence, geolocation data, and correspondence records. Still, despite all that, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't yet seen the full extent of the threat. The people orchestrating this weren't freelancers or common scammers. Their methods were too coordinated, too specific. They weren't just trying to spook him. They were collecting something. Soil data, environmental markers, boundary conditions. If it were a simple land grab, there were faster ways to pressure a rural landowner. But this was drawn out, systemic. That meant they were either building a paper case or waiting for an external trigger, some clause, some ruling, something bureaucratic that, once activated, would let them move openly and permanently. That night, as Eric walked the southern field, checking the barley with a flashlight, he found something he hadn't expected. Near the far edge of the field, close to the tree line, partially buried beneath a rock, was a smooth plastic disc the size of a hockey puck. At first, he thought it was trash, something washed in by rain. But when he touched it, it vibrated slightly and emitted a faint pulse of red light. A sensor, likely GPS, possibly more. He dug around it gently, finding a thin wire that snaked into the earth and disappeared toward the trees. He didn't pull it free. He simply covered it back up, marked the location in his notebook, and returned to the house. He didn't sleep at all that night, not because of fear, because of calculation. He now had a proof of embedded technology, on his property, placed without permission, serving unknown purposes, and whoever had placed it thought they could keep coming back. They were wrong. The next morning, Eric began with coffee, but not the usual slow, contemplative kind he sipped while watching dew pull back from the alfalfa. This time, it was tactical. Strong, black, fuel for focus. He didn't look at his crops or the weather. He looked at the manila envelope he'd sealed the night before, the one holding printed photos, time-coded footage, soil tag coordinates, and sensor mapping diagrams from his field. He didn't need more evidence to be convinced something serious was unfolding on his land. What he needed now was a shift in angle, away from the isolated battle he'd been fighting toward something broader, colder, and systemic. The next move, he knew, couldn't come from him alone. He called an old acquaintance, not a close friend, but someone he respected, Julia Fernandez, a regional coordinator who oversaw private contracts for agricultural tech pilots out of a Dallas field office. They had worked briefly together 5 years earlier during a logistics rollout involving sustainable irrigation systems. Julia had government access, a private sector mind, and an iron sense of when things didn't add up. He kept the conversation short and neutral, framing the situation as a request for guidance regarding unexplained land access and possible illegal data collection related to agriculture. She didn't ask many questions, just requested that he send the documents through a secure link. By midday, the package had been uploaded, encrypted, and acknowledged. Less than 2 hours later, she called back. "Eric," she said without preamble, "I've never seen this designation. Perimeter Clause 18C? That doesn't exist in our system. Neither does Territorial Safety Unit. But I ran the field signature on the photos. Those sensor discs? They match a type of soil monitoring prototype that was submitted 2 years ago under a defense research grant. It was never cleared for deployment." Eric didn't speak. He didn't have to. Julia continued. "The signal you picked up matches a phased pulse used for micro-resonance testing. Way more sensitive than anything used in commercial ag. It can map mineral density, root complexity, even moisture at sub-centimeter depth. But the kicker? That system was contracted to a private defense subunit working with urban security algorithms. They shouldn't be anywhere near farmland, let alone deploying on private property." She paused, then said something else, this time slower. "Eric, the funding paperwork lists them under the name CIRECO, CIRECO, listed as a Private Compliance Technology Consortium. That's not an agency. That's a clearinghouse, meaning there are layers here." Eric leaned back in his chair. The sun was creeping over the hill, washing the porch in sharp gold lines. He watched a hawk spiral above the field and thought about what she'd just said. A private defense contractor with surveillance-grade soil scanners had tagged his land, disguised through fake regulatory authority and scripted field agents. They were data harvesting. But for what? He thanked her. She said she'd alert a colleague in Washington, quietly, and that she would get back to him only if it was necessary. No trail, no open inquiries yet. That suited him fine. He didn't need attention. He needed leverage. By that evening, Eric had called in the land surveyor he'd retained a week earlier, a soft-spoken man named Boyd who'd worked government contracts in the past and knew how to navigate property diagnostics with discretion. Boyd scanned the section Eric had marked and verified the embedded sensor. They didn't remove it, not yet. Instead, Boyd placed a false cap several meters away, shielding the actual location from easy visual reference. It was a decoy, and Eric knew the importance of letting your opponent think their operation remained undisturbed. That night, Boyd reviewed Eric's recorded footage and made a passing comment that shifted the entire atmosphere. "These guys move like they know they're being watched. Look at the way the taller one rotates. Every 90 seconds, exact timing. Not casual." He was right. The footage revealed a pattern, not just in behavior but in spacing and body angle, suggesting the men were either trained or instructed to act within narrow physical parameters. They weren't surveyors. They were operatives playing surveyor. The next 48 hours passed in silence, and Eric used every minute. He photographed the decoy site, drafted sworn affidavits with his lawyer attesting to all discovered evidence and actions, and compiled a timeline spanning the initial letter to the most recent incident. It included surveillance logs, a full list of recorded plateless vehicles, and maps illustrating the pattern of activity converging on the lower western quadrant of his land. The volume of attention to that specific area puzzled him until he cross-referenced it with the mineral survey conducted during his land purchase years ago. The quadrant sat on top of a unique limestone vein with trace rare earth deposits, unextractable in small quantities, but strategically interesting in terms of environmental indicators. Combined with proximity to a dry watershed, it suggested the possibility of predictive modeling, his land being used unknowingly as a real-time data set for remote resource analysis. The realization made his skin crawl. He didn't waste time theorizing motives. He took action. Through his lawyer, he filed an information packet to the state's Department of Land Use Integrity, a rarely activated office designed to evaluate suspicious third-party activity on rural property. It didn't trigger enforcement, but it created a legal timestamp, an acknowledgement that he had noticed something wrong and had the evidence to back it up. He also met with his local cooperative board, He didn't show them everything, just enough to spark concern. He posed it as a security issue, unidentified agents using proprietary scanning tech, possible economic sabotage, and a need for region-wide awareness. He didn't expect a unified response, but the effect was immediate. 2 other farmers mentioned strange encounters. One had received a water use efficiency warning from a group called Centrifield Solutions. Another had noticed small divots in their upper pasture, thinking it was raccoons. It wasn't. They compared findings. Patterns emerged. Eric knew then that what had begun as a targeted maneuver was part of a broader strategy. Data mining across private agricultural zones under the camouflage of compliance and safety inspections. It explained the fake statutes, the cryptic terminology, and the impersonation of oversight. It also explained why no one official had intervened yet. The operators were working just below the surface of regulatory vision, using ambiguity as armor. But they'd made one mistake. They'd stayed too long. On the 3rd night after Julia's call, Eric caught them returning. His sensors tripped at 2:41 a.m., a shallow breach on the western fence line. He stayed inside, lights off, watching the motion pattern unfold across his screen. 3 bodies this time, not 2. One was stationed at the original sensor site. Another paced the outer edge, likely monitoring. The third was farther off holding something Eric didn't recognize. A new device. They were repositioning the array. He didn't call the sheriff. He didn't need to. Julia had put him in quiet contact with an internal field liaison, someone whose job it was to respond to gray zone surveillance operations when they crossed into legal territory. That contact had instructed Eric simply, "If they return and you confirm an active device placement, don't engage. Call this number and stay clear." Eric made the call. 38 minutes later, a black SUV with federal plates turned onto his road without lights. They didn't knock. They didn't ask for permission. They crossed the field on foot and disappeared into the trees. 30 minutes after that, the 3 men were escorted off his land in handcuffs. No shouting, no lights, just quiet extraction. By dawn, his land was still, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. For the first time, Eric wasn't the only one watching. Eric's land had returned to a deceptive calm after the federal intervention. The 3 operatives, apprehended during their clandestine nocturnal activity, were taken into custody without incident. The swift and silent extraction by federal agents left no trace of the confrontation. And by dawn, the farm appeared untouched, as if the intrusion had never occurred. However, Eric was acutely aware that this was merely a temporary reprieve. The underlying threat had not disappeared. It had simply shifted shape, peeled back momentarily by the exposure of those caught in the act. What lay behind them, and who they truly represented, remained untouched, unspoken, unacknowledged by any agency or office that might take meaningful action. Silence, Eric knew, was a strategic choice, just another form of containment. What he didn't expect was how quickly that silence would curdle into something more dangerous. Within 72 hours of the arrest, Eric noticed a shift, not on his property, but in the way the world around him began to behave. First, it was a call from the county permitting office informing him that his property had been flagged for a routine compliance sweep relating to secondary structures. He asked for specifics. They had none. Just a notice generated by an automated workflow tied to an unnamed complaint. Next came an abrupt letter from his agricultural supplier in Fort Worth, citing an uncertain regulatory climate and temporarily freezing deliveries until clarity could be confirmed. That same day, the fuel vendor called, advising that his account was under review due to inconsistencies in property designation now circulating in their compliance queue. These weren't random glitches or panicked overreactions. They were signals. Someone was pulling on levers, quiet, bureaucratic ones designed not to accuse, but to isolate. The invisible hand that had operated with stealth before was now reaching into Eric's logistics, squeezing his ability to function. He reached out to Julia, informing her of the developments. She responded with a single line. "Understood. Do not escalate directly. Watch and document." That told him everything. The arrests had triggered something, perhaps exposed too much. Now the pushback had moved from field-level harassment to institutional throttling. He wasn't being watched anymore. He was being squeezed into silence. Eric did not comply. He doubled down, formalizing every contact, every supply delay, every vague warning into logged incidents, complete with dates, times, phone numbers, and, whenever possible, names. He knew what was happening was not coincidental. They weren't trying to win a court case. They were trying to destabilize him through operational attrition, starve the project, cripple the schedule, push him toward sale or abandonment. It was a pressure campaign with no fingerprints, just shadows. But Eric had long ago learned how to survive in low-light conditions. He met with his attorney and expanded the scope of their civil filings, adding interference with commercial agreements and suspicion of coordinated administrative harassment. The filings were long shots, strategically framed to slow any further backroom maneuvers. He wasn't aiming to win in court. He was laying groundwork, building a case that couldn't be buried or ignored when the time came to force acknowledgement. The next blow came through the water. Eric's well system, deep and historically reliable, suddenly began showing signs of pressure anomalies. At first, he suspected a failing pump or sediment influx, but the readings made no sense. The flow would stutter during specific windows of time, then resume as if untouched. He brought in an independent hydrologist, a contractor with no ties to the region, and authorized a full subsoil scan. What they found was chilling. A secondary bore, unauthorized, had been drilled within 40 feet of Eric's primary shaft, angled laterally and consistent with covert groundwater tapping. Worse, there were signs that a low-frequency vibration source had been introduced, enough to subtly disrupt well performance and trigger pressure instability over time. It was sabotage, executed with surgical precision. Eric reported the findings, filed the geological data, and requested immediate protective designation through the state's Environmental Safeguarding Clause for agricultural resources. The designation, if granted, would lock the land into a high-priority zone, requiring government oversight for any future inspection or external activity. He wasn't naive. It would take weeks or months to process. But the application itself served another purpose. It put a spotlight on his property that couldn't be turned off by quiet consensus. Then came the retaliation. 3 days after submitting the protective application, Eric was served, personally, by a private courier. The document was a cease and desist notice from a shell firm operating under the name Agrival Analytics LLC, claiming that Eric had unlawfully interfered with a contracted environmental study funded under a provisional municipal development permit. The permit number cited did not exist in any database Eric or his attorney could access. The accusation: tampering with data collection equipment installed under shared jurisdiction authorization. The letter demanded immediate removal of obstructions to sensor access and warned of legal action if continued interference occurred. Eric felt a new kind of heat rising in his chest. Not the sharp, immediate kind brought on by trespass or threat, but the slow, corrosive kind that accompanies systemic betrayal. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't even covert anymore. It was an open assertion of authority by a non-existent entity citing a fictional permit to enforce control over private land. And it had been delivered to his front door, face to face, by someone wearing a suit and holding a clipboard as if the whole thing were just another mundane delivery. He didn't respond directly. Instead, he copied the document, scanned it, and sent it to Julia with the header: "Threat phase has shifted." She replied an hour later: "Federal Review Team notified. Maintain posture. Do not remove device. Do not initiate contact." That last part hit like a hammer. He realized then that the embedded sensor, still sitting beneath the western plot under decoy cover, was now bait. It was evidence, yes, but also a trap, a signal being monitored not just by those who placed it, but now by those watching the watchers. The moment had arrived where the farm was no longer a passive target. It had become a contested node in a deeper conflict Eric couldn't yet see the edges of. The following evening, under cover of rain, another team attempted entry. This time, Eric saw them first, blurred figures on infrared, moving low and fast. They reached the decoy marker. When they dug, they found only rock and steel, a false signal reflector embedded beneath an industrial trash lid. It emitted a click when disturbed, a coded alert Eric had rigged into his monitoring grid. Less than 10 minutes later, another black SUV arrived. This one didn't stop at the gate. Eric stayed in the house. He didn't need to watch. By morning, the device was gone. The lawsuit, days later, was quietly withdrawn. AgriVault analytics ceased to exist online, but the pressure didn't stop. What came next was a letter from the IRS. He was being audited. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope with a federal return address, stamped not with urgency but with a quiet kind of inevitability. Eric had seen plenty of audits conducted over the years, on clients, on vendors, on partnerships that collapsed under the weight of delayed filings or speculative write-offs, but never had one arrived so perfectly timed, so surgically deployed. The document itself was thin, no more than 4 pages, but its weight was immense. It opened with formal language, referencing a routine review of agricultural tax credits, and listed a selection of deductions he had claimed over the last 5 years. Soil rehabilitation expenses, drought resilience equipment, even fuel tax returns. For off-road diesel use, all legal, all documented, and all approved in previous years. Yet suddenly, all of it was under scrutiny. The review window extended backward in time, deeper than necessary, and the language bore a tone that suggested suspicion long before it implied formality. This wasn't a random audit. This was pressure, elevated to federal scale. Eric read through it slowly, twice. The first time he scanned for threats, for traps, for language that hinted at criminality or escalation. There were none. The second time, he read for patterns. He noticed how specific line items had been chosen, expenditures that relied heavily on external verification. It would be easy to delay responses, require receipts from vendors, trigger third-party inconsistencies. And in a climate where his accounts had already been flagged and suppliers had begun backing away under regulatory pressure, those documents would be harder to gather. He knew the tactic well: weaponize bureaucracy, use paperwork as leverage. This was about attrition, not prosecution. He called his accountant, an old and sharp man named Vince who had served clients through 3 recessions and the farm crisis of the 80s. Vince confirmed what Eric already suspected. The audit had not been triggered by financial irregularity. The profile flag that initiated it came from a non-standard queue, a keyword-flagged compliance algorithm designed for financial risk exposure in federally insured sectors. In short, someone had fed Eric's profile into a system designed to isolate economic disruptors. It was a trick pulled from post-9/11 intelligence operations and now being used against a farmer in northern Texas. Vince was calm but serious. "This isn't about your taxes," he said. "This is about you being a problem to someone powerful enough to weaponize the IRS. You have 2 choices. You can comply quietly and hope it ends there. Or you can push back and risk them going deeper." Eric chose a third option. He authorized Vince to compile a full digital ledger of the last 10 years, clean, organized, bulletproof, and submit it with a cover letter that included copies of all correspondence relating to the prior harassment, including the notices, the illegal, surveillance, the federal intervention, and the now withdrawn lawsuit. He framed it not as defiance, but as clarity. Transparency offered in good faith, under the presumption that the audit was, as claimed, routine. Simultaneously, he authorized his legal team to file a pattern of retaliation notice with the Department of Justice, a rarely used instrument designed to signal the appearance of governmental tools being used for private leverage. The filing itself didn't initiate an investigation, but it triggered an internal audit queue designed to prevent misuse of administrative systems. It was a knife slipped quietly into the machine. Days passed, then weeks. The audit did not escalate, but neither did it close. It hung over his operations like a weather front, slow-moving, oppressive, and ever-present. Eric adapted. He doubled his record-keeping. Every invoice was scanned, cross-referenced, and time-stamped. Every conversation with the supplier was documented. He moved silently, methodically, building his defense not just for the IRS but for whatever came next. And then, one night, it did. The sound came just before 3 a.m., a low mechanical hum, not from his equipment, but from the eastern edge of the property near the old irrigation line. Eric, already sleeping lightly, was dressed and outside within minutes. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need to. His monitoring grid had already begun sending alerts. Perimeter breach, signal spike, environmental anomaly. But this time, the pattern was different. The system wasn't detecting human movement. It was detecting machinery. By the time Eric reached the ridgeline overlooking the eastern field, he saw it clearly. A single unmarked utility vehicle, low profile with mounted equipment on its roof, was parked at the edge of his property, less than a meter from the legal boundary. Cables ran from the back of the vehicle into the ground, threading beneath the fence through a narrow trench no more than 6 inches wide. Whoever was operating the device was doing so remotely. The vehicle was empty. Eric didn't approach. Instead, he activated the recording drone and circled the scene from 200 feet up. The drone's live feed showed thermal signatures, not human, but active circuits radiating heat. The equipment wasn't just scanning soil, it was transmitting, broadcasting. The signal, once analyzed by his consultant, was revealed to be encrypted and burst-patterned, an upload, not a probe. Someone was collecting data that had been harvested weeks ago and sending it out in real time. He didn't need to guess why. That morning, he contacted Julia and sent the footage with a single line. "They've switched to extraction." Her reply was immediate. "Understood. Hold. We're moving." Within 48 hours, federal agents arrived, not in the quiet, informal manner of before, but with full authority. The property perimeter was temporarily seized under Title 18, Section 1030, Federal Protection Against Unauthorized Access to Computer Systems. The signal interception, combined with the history of embedded sensors and sabotage, had qualified as a cyber-physical attack on a private entity engaged in critical infrastructure. Agriculture now being considered such under evolving national guidelines. The vehicle was impounded. The cables were traced. The signal was mapped to an offshore server routed through 6 shell companies and ultimately leading to a single holding firm headquartered in a country known for corporate opacity. It wasn't just domestic harassment anymore. It was international intelligence collection, unofficial, unsanctioned, and illegal. Eric watched as agents documented the site, collected the hardware, and secured the property with quiet efficiency. No one told him what came next. No one had to. He had already crossed the boundary where answers mattered less than actions. What had started as a land dispute, a fake inspection, a few pieces of odd paperwork, had now revealed itself as a part of a much larger strategy, one that viewed rural autonomy as a vulnerability to be exploited. But the system had blinked. They'd pushed too far. They'd been caught in the act. And now, for the first time, they weren't the ones watching. They were being watched. The agents left as swiftly as they'd arrived, taking with them the black utility vehicle, the cables, the embedded transmitter, and a silence that was heavier than any noise. Eric stood at the edge of his land long after the last SUV disappeared beyond the ridge, boots planted in the same soil that had once been nothing more than a dream of independence. The field was still, but the quiet no longer brought peace. It brought aftermath. He knew what that meant. This wasn't closure. This was containment. Somewhere beyond his reach, meetings were already taking place, reports being written, lawyers redacting statements, and executives holding crisis talks in rooms with tinted glass. Someone's operation had been publicly compromised, and the natural instinct of institutions at that level wasn't confession. It was damage control. The following days unfolded like a slow, clinical unpacking of a sealed box. A representative from the Department of Agriculture called to inform Eric, politely, in guarded tones, that his land had been designated as a sensitive development zone for an indefinite period while security evaluations were completed. The language was hollow. It meant nothing operationally, but it told him one thing clearly. The federal government didn't intend to prosecute. At least, not yet. What had been exposed was larger than they could openly admit, and Eric, inconveniently, had been both the target and the witness. They couldn't silence him, so they reclassified him, put a label on his land, tucked it into a bureaucratic corner, and hoped the story would go stale. No arrest records were released. No agency claimed responsibility for any operation. The companies involved, or what little remained of them, were dissolved through quiet back doors and registered as inactive within days. His lawyer reviewed the audit status and informed him that the IRS had closed its file. No further action. No apology either. Just silence. The same day, his fuel supplier reinstated his delivery schedule without explanation, and the agricultural vendor sent a form letter offering to restore full-service terms, citing a clerical oversight. Eric accepted none of the apologies, because none had been offered. What he received were corrections, reversals of calculated pressure dressed as administrative adjustments. They thought he'd be relieved. In truth, he was only more certain that his initial instincts had been correct from the beginning. No one would protect him but himself. Julia called him only once more, late one evening as the heat began to lift off the fields and the cicadas droned softly across the hills. Her voice was softer than before, marked with the weight of what she couldn't say. She told him that his case had been escalated internally and that actions had been taken beyond her clearance. She couldn't confirm what would happen next, only that he should expect no further contact unless he initiated it. He asked her bluntly if she believed any of it was ever about the land. She was silent for a moment, then said, "It was never about just the land, Eric. It was about what your land let them test." That answer didn't bring comfort. It brought clarity. Eric spent the following weeks doing what he'd always done, working. He repaired the southern fence, replaced a worn-out coupling on the main pump line, and harvested his barley, loading it himself with the steady hands of someone who no longer cared whether he was being watched. He kept records, meticulous and cold. The grid he'd built stayed online, feeding encrypted logs into a cloud storage protocol held under 3 separate legal jurisdictions. He didn't trust outcomes anymore, only process. Neighbors began to approach again. Slowly at first, but steadily. The ones who had watched from a distance during the worst of the pressure now came forward, some with questions, others just with quiet respect. A few had their own stories, odd visits, strange mailers, out-of-state phone calls asking about soil samples or irrigation patterns. Eric listened without judgment and offered them one thing in return: structure. He taught them how to log activity, how to encrypt, how to request audits without triggering exposure. He didn't form a group. He didn't hold meetings. But a quiet network formed nonetheless. Landowners who now knew better than to assume they were beneath notice. In time, the tension on the land faded. No more visits, no more letters, no more trucks with no plates or men with no names. But Eric never mistook that silence for safety. It was just a new phase, a pause in a larger pattern he could only glimpse from ground level. He never sought revenge. Not because he lacked the will, but because he understood the shape of what he was up against. Systems that fed on silence and complexity didn't fear outbursts. They feared exposure. So he prepared for the day when the pattern would repeat elsewhere. He knew the signs now, knew the methods, and if someone like him called for help, he'd be ready. Because in the end, the most dangerous kind of resistance wasn't loud or chaotic. It was deliberate, and it remembered everything.